Historically, when it comes to ancient human sacrifices, usually archaeologists and bioarchaeologists will look at the body and they'll look for cut marks, blunt force trauma, anything that shows that there's been some form of trauma done onto the body. But my intervention at the largest mass human sacrifice event in the Americas and possibly the world, at Rancho Quito Las Llamas, I use both the skeletal elements and the mummified tissues to reconstruct archaeological molecules to understand essentially what happened to them in the months leading up to ritual execution. My name is Ben Schaefer. I am currently a PhD candidate finishing up my degrees at University of Illinois Chicago in the Field Museum of Natural History. I specialize in bioarchaeological anthropology, meaning that I study human remains in archaeological contexts. A lot of people are really interested in studying the sacrifice event and the specific modes of sacrifice or how that was done. I'm more interested in understanding the social processes by reconstructing the socially embodied lived experiences from archaeological hormones, stable isotopes, and genomics, using hair in 1 month increments to reconstruct kind of their stress levels, their diet levels, etc. And specifically for the hormones, it allows me to understand their stress responses to both environmental and social systems that are occurring. So for example, did they wake up that day and be chosen to be sacrificed, or did they have about a year beforehand and were told what they were going to do, wined and dined, and had this kind of social death away from their community prior to ritual execution? When it comes to stable isotopes, this allows me to get a better idea of seasonality of sacrifice by what they're being provisioned with in terms of food. So are they getting enough maize? Are they getting more llama meat, etc.? It also allows me to provide a more nuanced perspective to understand social hierarchies and who specifically within the sample is getting a provisioned more or less with certain types of food. And then when it comes to genomics, what we're looking at is understanding essentially who these individuals were and taking a more multi-method approach to flesh in these human sacrifices that were deposited in the muddy ground after a torrential El Nino about 600 years ago, 650 years ago. One thing that's really interesting about sacrificial practices is that we have one that's detailed very nicely, specifically about the Inca imperial Capacocha sacrifices. And here I like to explain these as kind of like a Hunger Games-esque approach, where children would be selected from all over the empire, wined and dined and brought to Cusco, where they would stay for about a year or so and go through a metaphorical death away from their community. And then eventually they would be brought up to a sacred mountaintop or an apu, given fermented maize chicha beer, ayahuasca, coca leaves to chew, as well as potentially Nectandra subspecies, which is like a natural paralytic found in a lot of sacrificial contexts, and then bludgeoned over the head. And so in this, we have this really nice, highly choreographed, very scripted way of ritual. But outside of this imperial context, sacrifice is going to look incredibly different, where on the North Coast where I work, they may have been selected, but it's probably also very likely that they just woke up that day and were selected to be sacrificed. One thing that I like to do with my death students at the beginning of the semester to kind of set them into an intro to death studies, but also get them thinking about what we're going to be talking about throughout the semester, is what does death look like to them? And in this assignment, I ask them to provide as much detail about what death as a corporeal figure-ish looks like. And the example that I give my students is that when I die, I think that I'm going to be greeted by death, but death is going to be in the form of my cat, Cascara. Because although she's super cute and I absolutely love her, she has fangs that are bigger than her mouth, so they pop out like a little vampire. She has a rusting undertone to her fur. Her nails are so sharp and always cuts me up. Since my cat's going to die before I do, death is going to be something familiar to me. So when I die, I'm going to see my own cat that's going to welcome me to the afterlife. And that's just something fun that I do with my students. So when it comes to burials, and specifically in the United States, it's a really interesting story for the most part, because burials is a relatively more new phenomenon that is not necessarily just about people that have money and are able to bury the dead, but now it becomes something that everybody's able to do. Specifically in this exhibit, we have a couple of different forms of burial practices that are more nuanced. But specifically here, we have Capsula Mundi burial pod, where you essentially get returned back to the earth as your body decomposes and decays. And then eventually a tree or some kind of shrubbery will grow out of here. There's also different forms of cremation practices, from basic cremation with like fire that you might be more familiar with, all the way up into more environmentally friendly cremation practices such as alkaline hydrosis. So using a form of water, lye, and heating it up to essentially decompose the soft tissue. Permeation, which is going to be more about the freezing of the body and specifically freeze drying the body with liquid nitrogen, to having the cremains brought back as a diamond that you can wear as a pendant or some kind of specific adornment. One really interesting form of ceramic and specific practice is the moche ceramic pots that we see coming from the north coast of Peru. What's really interesting about these is that they have a great wealth of icons, colors, things that they're depicting. But two things that are really interesting specifically about this pottery is that they're very well known for their sex pottery, as well as the images of death that are also depicted on the pottery. So right now I'm finishing up my PhDs, and afterwards I am hoping to publish more about my research, specifically on the archaeological hormones. I have a few post-PhD projects looking at the stable isotopes, so to get more at the seasonality of sacrifice, and then think about that in terms of stress and diet and how they're interacting with each other in the months leading up to sacrifice. Beyond that, I have a few other students that have been working on different death projects that kind of tangentially relate to my doctoral research, or at least what I can advise on. So I have students that are interested in looking at trans queer death in 80 bodily horror, all the way up to working on my project looking at ritual drug usage in the months leading up to human sacrifice. So there's a lot of stuff that's still coming out, and I'm really excited to see where it goes, at least in the next couple of years.